We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts as well. Today, I'm really happy to be joined by my colleague, John Daniel Davidson. He's the politics editor at The Federalist. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
One of the issues that John covers the most closely of everything and does amazing reporting on and has for years is the crisis at the Mexican border, the U.S.-Mexican border. Now, President Biden was asked, I believe just yesterday or the day before, whether he thinks there is indeed a crisis at the border, and he said no. John, you have some new reporting just published today that gets to this question. What is your response to President Biden's point there?
But with all due respect, Mr. President, there is a crisis at the border, and it's getting worse seemingly by the day. You mentioned new reporting that we posted today, and we'll get into that. But really, it's almost like every day there's new reporting coming out, and not just from the Federalist or from other maybe right of center sources, but even the mainstream media can't ignore it because when crises get going at the border, they tend to sort of take on a life of their own, and they tend to escalate quickly. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're starting to see the kinds of things at the border that we usually see in the springtime. We're like 2 months early for running out of bed space for unaccompanied minors, for example, which is happening right now. I think they're at 97% capacity. We're a couple months early for groups of families to be turning themselves in to Border Patrol and sort of overwhelming those Border Patrol facilities that are right there on the border. That's happening right now. So what's going to happen in a couple months, in April and May, is going to be much worse than what happened in April and May in 2019, which was the sort of the height of the crisis. As bad of a border crisis as we'd had in more than a decade. This is when President Trump told Mexico that if they didn't get it under control on their side, he was going to slap a 5% tariff on all imports, which prompted the Mexican president Lopez Obrador to deploy the National Guard to Mexico's southern border and to work with the Trump administration on the migrant protection protocols, or the Remain in Mexico policy, which the Biden administration has revoked. So all signs point to what I would call like a rolling crisis at the border. There's so many facets to it, and it's just sort of like, the train has kind of left the station. It doesn't matter what the administration does now. We have a full-blown crisis on our hands.
So how did it change with the change in administration? And some of this is, it's outside of the legislative scope. These are things that come through the massive bureaucracy and the executive branch, the larger executive branch in terms of policies. What changed when the president switched from Donald Trump to Joe Biden?
Really, all that needed to happen was that the presidency needed to switch from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. In a way, like the policy changes, even the executive orders that the Biden signed on his first day in office and that he's signed since are almost beside the point. And the reason is, and I've been saying this a lot lately, when it comes to the border, messaging is everything. The message that goes out from the United States, from the federal government, really to a large extent determines what happens at the border, because the smuggling networks and the cartels and all of the various parts of the sort of this industrialized black market in migrant smuggling will use anything to be able to convince people to pay them money or go into debt to come north and get across the border. So the damage was sort of already done by the time Biden got elected, because the message from Biden and the message from Democrats for years now of the Trump administration has been, as soon as we get into power, we're going to roll back all of these Trump era policies. We're going to give amnesty. We're going to reinstitute the Obama era catch and release policy that was responsible for the border crisis in 2014. And we're going to put an end to the migrant protection protocols. In other words, if you get in legally or illegally, you can stay at least, while you're waiting for your asylum hearing. And that, of course, can take years, and everyone knows that, and the smugglers know that. So the policy it comes after the message. But the policies itself are bad enough. You have the UN escorting migrants across the international bridge in South Texas right now. The migrant camps in Mexico are emptying out, but even as they're emptying out, more camps are cropping up because, of course, other people in Central America, other people in Mexico see this happening, and it becomes a magnet. And this is what I mean by kind of a rolling crisis. That the snowball starts running down the hill, and there's a chain reaction. And how many more metaphors can I squeeze in there? The changes can be slight. Obviously, no new laws have been passed. There's just been these executive orders and these changes sort of in policy, but enough of them have conveyed the message both to prospective migrants and to the cartel-associated smuggling networks that now is the time to come. If you get across the border, you can most likely stay.
Now, for somebody who follows us as closely as you do, this may seem like a really stupid question, but I want to ask because it's basic, and I don't follow the issue as closely, and maybe it's something that I take for granted. But I want to know, what do you think the consequences of, and this is just not something that is talked about because the media shuts down any critical discussion of friendly policies like the Biden administration's towards illegal immigrants. But what consequences do you foresee, or do you think are the most likely to have a negative impact on our country? Actually, I know John hates the word impact, so I won't say impact. I'll say, what do you see as the most negative, the most negative effects? What are the consequences, like the really concrete things that we could see coming to fruition because of the shift in policy?
The most immediate effect would be a humanitarian crisis at the border, and that is despite the Biden administration's insistence that they have this under control, despite Biden's insistence that there's not a crisis, or the DHS secretary's insistence that it's a challenge, but it's not a crisis. No, it's not like you can just snap your fingers and have housing for 20,000 minors on the U.S.-Mexico border, like in a month. It doesn't work like that. It's the logistical reality of what can happen on the border when large numbers of people decide to come across in a very short period of time. It will create a humanitarian disaster, which is what we saw in 2014. It's what we saw in 2019. It's what we're going to see this spring, despite any kind of preparations that the administration tries to put in place. In May of 2019, 1,000 people crossed the border near El Paso in a group of 1,000 people crossed the border and turned themselves in to a Border Patrol agent. There's no infrastructure in the Border Patrol stations or the CBP facilities in the El Paso sector to deal with 1,000 people. It just doesn't exist. And so the immediate effect is an actual humanitarian disaster. I don't think the media is going to report it as a disaster, but it's going to be, and it's going to be worse than what we saw in 2019, which was bad enough in 2019. You did have people kind of in these outdoor chain link fenced areas, and problems getting food and services to children and families, and there's a couple children died in Border Patrol custody after sort of walking out of the desert, turning themselves into Border Patrol. These large groups, hundreds of people, and Border Patrol has to figure out who's had water, who's has heat stroke, and we're going to see more of that, and it's going to be. It's going to be a crisis and a disaster. And the problem is, I don't know if there's the political will or the political incentive for Democrats and for the Biden administration to do what's necessary to disincentivize and deter people from coming. So once this crisis gets going, and once people start coming in, and once they start letting people in, I don't know why it would stop. unless we put something in place on our end to put an end to it.
Well, and obviously a huge deterrent for implementing those deterrents would be negative coverage from the legacy media and the corporate press of any such policies. The family separation policy, which was not a unique creation of the Trump administration, was immediately derided by everyone, and there's reasonable arguments, of course, against such a policy. But what would some of those, what would doing what is necessary look like? What are some policies that could be implemented right away, or policies that could be revoked even, that would help the United States handle this crisis in a more humane and effective way?
You need to get the message out there to people that they should not send their children to the border. And one way to do that is to very quickly start sending minors back to their sending communities, fly them back home. And not just minors, but adults as well. You got to get the message back to the sending communities in Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador and in Mexico as well, that it's not true. Don't listen to the smugglers. They're lying when they tell you if you can get in, you can stay. The problem is, if the smugglers aren't lying, then if you actually can stay once you get in, if you will be released with a notice to appear 6 months from now, before an immigration judge, then no one will listen to your message not to come. Or as the DHS secretary said, don't come, at least not yet. So there's that, and then the other aspect of this that we should talk about, that maybe we should have talked about first, which is what I wrote about today, is that the incentive to keep this going and to keep bringing people into the country. There's huge incentives on the Mexican side of the border because the smuggling networks and the cartels that control this territory along the border in northern Mexico are making a lot of money doing this. They're making billions of dollars a year. And one of the things that has just come out from us and from a few other outlets this week is the wristbands. So the smuggling networks have contracts with the cartels, and they're issuing wristbands to migrants in stash houses on the Mexican side. And the wristbands have numbers on them. They're connected to a database that has personal information for each migrant. So their name, their cell phone number, the names of their families, their home addresses of their families in the country of origin, the cell phone numbers of their families, and their destination in the United States. And the reason they have all that information is because these people, owe the cartels and they owe the smugglers a lot of money. What they charge, almost none of the migrants can just pay up front and be done. They're like in debt bondage to these criminal organizations. Even if they're released in the United States, even if they get legal status in the United States, they're still indebted to these cartels and smuggling networks. In some cases, for thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars. And so the wristbands are a way for the cartels and the smuggling networks to keep track of who has paid, how much they've paid, where they are, how to get in touch with them. It's a very sophisticated operation. And, law enforcement agencies on the border are starting to find these discarded wristbands all over the place on the north side of the Rio Grande. Just littered, throughout sort of the scrub brush and the riverlands there in South Texas, and it's an indication of how things have changed for the cartels and the smugglers. They didn't do this in 2019, and one of the things that I've heard talking to people is that the cartels and the smugglers missed out on some money in 2019 because the crisis and the groups and the caravans and the number of people crossing. It got such a great volume so quickly, and it got out of hand that not everyone was paying, and it was hard for them to keep track of who had paid and who hadn't and who was going where. So in the meantime, they're smart. These are multinational criminal syndicates. So they set up this system so that the next time this happened, the next time there was a big surge on the border, they would be ready and organized to be able to collect payment from everybody, to be able to keep track of everybody, to get paid in full, and not to have anyone cross the border who doesn't pay.
Obviously, a huge component of this, and as you talk about the cartels, this is, essential context is what's happening in the countries south of the US border. So in Mexico and in Central America, I think the situations have devolved into crises that are pushing people to come into the country. Now, can you speak to what has changed in some of those countries, be it El Salvador, Honduras, or Mexico, that might be pushing more and more people up towards the United States? Or are
Sure.
things getting better? And is United States aid helping or hurting the situation in any particular way?
Things are not getting better. Things are not getting better. Um, Central America, especially Honduras, is sort of imploding. The economy there is disintegrating. And one of the big things that's happened recently, I believe it was in November, two hurricanes hit Central America and caused a lot of damage and a lot of death and destruction. And the economy there was already suffering because of the COVID lockdowns and pandemic travel restrictions, which had basically decimated, those very already fragile economies. So the combination of the pandemic and these hurricanes that hit in November have just left, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people with very few choices. And so when that coinciding with Biden's victory and the message from Democrats that like things are going to change at the border, for a lot of people, it was the most obvious choice to make in the world. We're going to go north. We're going to get into the United States however we can, and start working there to be able to send money back to our families. And that's what a lot of people are doing. So the push factors, as they're called in these countries, are very, very strong. Same thing in Mexico. Obviously, Mexico, wasn't hit with the hurricane the way Central America was, but its economy has suffered greatly from the pandemic and from lockdowns and just all the effects of all that. And people are coming in to be able to work and to send money home. And the macro kind of situation is that the United States cannot just allow these Central American countries and the Mexico to just implode because it creates irresistible incentives for those people to come north and to get into the United States to be able to provide for their families. We can't have like failed states on our southern border and in Central America. It is not a long-term sustainable solution. We are going to continue to have border crises forever until we can figure out a way to help those places stabilize and reduce some of those incentives for people to come north.
Something interesting that you said earlier is that this is like a rolling crisis. It has so many different components. And as somebody who does not follow this as closely as you do, it seems to me that the issue crops up when the left wants to talk about it. Like it's essentially a political football. And like suddenly there will be a crisis, or you'll see talk about mistreatment of migrants, as they say. And we find out, well, this has been happening for years. You're just talking about it right now because for some reason it's like what's come up in your email listservs. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
So what is your theory on how the left's strategy towards this issue? When are they using it? Why do they in fact sort of just bring it up when it's useful for them? How this is a crazy question, but it's a crazy rambling question, I should say. But can you speak to the left strategy when it comes to using this issue as a political football?
I think it's pretty straightforward, actually. They don't want to talk about it when Democrats are in charge. It doesn't matter what happens. I mean, it's been said many times now over and over, but sort of like the facilities for minors and a lot of the policies that Trump was criticized for were first implemented by the Obama administration in 2014 or 2015. And at the time, what stopped the Obama administration from sort of detaining children and detaining families, it wasn't that they had a crisis of conscience, like, oh, this is wrong to put kids in cages. It's because a federal judge said, no, I'm interpreting this settlement from the 90s, the Flores settlement, to mean that you can't detain families with children, even if they're together, for more than 20 days. And so And so the Obama administration was switched to catch and release after a federal judge basically made that argument. But like nobody was talking about that at the time. That wasn't like all over the papers, like, oh, the federal judge stopped the Obama administration from putting kids in cages. No, it's only when Republicans are in power that this becomes sort of like this moral issue, and we have, you know, AOC kind of like weeping and like clutching the chain link fence and stuff. The migrant crisis, or the unaccompanied minor crisis that's about to happen and that's already started, is going to be way worse than what happened in 2014. It's going to be way worse than what happened in 2014. And AOC is not going to go down to the border and weep outside the gates of these facilities. I guarantee you that. And the mainstream media is not going to talk about kids in cages. They're already, you know, it's facilities. You know, it's like youth facilities. They make it sound like a camp. You know,
it's a YMCA. Yeah,
it's a YMCA on the border. You know, so that's why it's so important for us to talk about this stuff and to bring and sort of explain too that like this is a really sophisticated operation that's going on the border. These people aren't coming by accident. There's massive amounts of money that are changing hands. There's incentives involved, and the Democrats and the Biden administration are juicing those incentives. They're the ones who are creating the incentives through their policies. And then the smugglers just run with that, you know. You know, and then there's another piece of this that at the risk of of me rambling on and on, is that the money that's made from the migrant smuggling, you know, billions of dollars a year, is used to finance cartel wars in Mexico. That's you know, the drug money finances cartel wars, you know, obviously, but the migrant money does too. There are some cartel factions on the U.S.-Mexico border that are making more money off of smuggling migrants and sort of collecting a tax from the smuggling networks than they are selling drugs. And a lot of these wristbands that we were showing earlier, those were found across the border from Roma, Texas. So that's down in the Rio Grande Valley, and the Mexican area there, the territory in Mexico that is in that area is being contested right now by two cartel factions are fighting over that plot. They call them plazas. That plaza, which is essentially a sort of a drug corridor. A lot of drugs move through there. But a lot of migrants are moving through there right now as well. And, you know, the one faction, the Gulf Cartel, has controlled that area for a long time. And then another group that is sort of the rebranded group associated with the Zetas is now fighting for control. And so they're like, you know, pitched gun battles, you know, not like with pistols, but with like 50 caliber, you know, machine guns and whatnot that are going on right across the border from Roma, Texas, as these cartels kind of compete for this territory. And the migrant smuggling operations are largely funding that conflict right now. So all of these things are connected, and there's a lot of bad guys down there, and they're doing bad things. But the Democrats and the media are not going to talk about it because, as you say, it is just a political football. That they don't actually. I don't think they actually care, you know, about the sort of the long-term consequences, or even the you know, the humanitarian aspect of it. Because if they did, well, then they would be raising the alarm right now.
I was going to say, it's hard to believe that they do, because it sounds to me like you have these elites in the Democratic Party and in their sympathetic media that are enabling the cartels, and the cartels abuse women. They are destroying their countries, and they are completely leaving impoverished and desperate people worse off and thrusting them into a worse humanitarian crisis. Is it like they're prioritizing their kind of political wokeism, the political expediency of sounding woke and acting woke, over the desperate and impoverished people that they're enabling the poor treatment of?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is it's narrative. You know, everything's narrative, and so the narrative has to be that the Biden administration and the Democrats are going to be compassionate, where Trump and the Republicans were cruel and, you know, sort of like fascist, and everything. And this isn't just true of the border. This is, as you well know, this is true of every issue. But the narrative trumps the facts, and so this is how you get, Jim Acosta kind of driving through McAllen, and going out behind like a Burger King, and like walking up to the border fence and being like, I don't see any migrants. I guess there's not a crisis. What now? Why did he do that? Because the Trump administration was saying we have a crisis down there, and sure enough, someone should have told Acosta that like the fence is completely in U.S. territory. They don't build it on the border, so you have to get on the south side of the fence. But it's just narrative. A lot of it is performative. It's the outrage, kind of the moral outrage and the virtue signaling is performative, I think, for the left, because they have cast themselves as the champions of the kind of the migrant and the downtrodden and the poor. But what they don't talk about and what they won't admit is that the policies that they advocate are not compassionate. They create misery because they incentivize these black markets. They incentivize these really bad guys in the cartels and these smugglers to abuse and mistreat migrants. To, as you mentioned, a lot of the women get sexually assaulted and abused. To use children as basically props to posing as their parents to get into the country. That does happen, despite the media's insistence that it doesn't. So it's performative and it's motivated by narrative, and I think that it's possible to break through that, but unfortunately, it's going to take a absolutely catastrophic crisis at the border for the mainstream media to be forced to kind of cover it and get real about what the Biden administration policies have done.
So when I was growing up in the early years of the Bush administration, I remember these conversations about immigration happened so often in the context of economic fairness and about the labor market. And what's interesting to me talking to you is that so much of the conversation is about safety. It's about, how the cartels are treating the people that are coming up through the border and crime at the border. And I'm wondering if you think some of the reason the left sort of sticks to this messaging of compassion and framing their argument in terms of compassion and inclusion and love and whatever other buzzwords that they throw out. Do you think some of it is rooted in the fact that they still want to frame and cast the right as sort of just purely having economic interests when it comes to border issues? Or like, I'm just trying to figure out what their incentive is actually to cling to this messaging when it flies in the face of the video evidence that we have coming from the border constantly of the horrific treatment of people who are desperate, people who are trying to have better lives.
And who are being terribly taken advantage of. We just had this week that the SUV in California had 25 migrants in it, was hit by a tractor trailer. 13 people died. That was part of a 2 SUV caravan that had something like 45 people between the 2 SUVs. All the seats had been taken out, and they were all packed in there. It also comes as news broke this week that dozens of migrants that had been released in South Texas tested positive for COVID. And obviously the conditions that a lot of these migrants are in when they're being transported through Mexico and into the United States, the very close quarters. They don't, a lot of times they're not wearing masks. And so conditions are ripe either for an accident like we had in California, very tragic, or for COVID transmission as well. I think the border has changed, but the way Democrats want to talk about it, hasn't changed with the border. So it used to be that employment and economic factors, as you mentioned, were a lot of that was a lot of what was that was the dynamic. A lot of times people would come across the border to work, even just for the day, and then go back across at the end of the day, or they would come across for seasonal work and go back, and there was more ingress and egress and coming and going.
Well, and that, by the way, was why people like Bernie Sanders had a very different position on immigration years ago,
Yeah,
and why
absolutely.
libertarians were very pro the open
It
borders
was it
policy.
was the left, it was the labor left in the 60s that shut down the Bracero program, which was the original kind of guest worker program they instituted during World War II to get farm workers in here. And Cesar Chavez and the United Agricultural Workers are the ones that shut it down because they didn't want to compete with Mexican labor. So yeah, the left's position used to be very much, they didn't want to compete with cheap foreign labor coming over from Mexico. And now, but back then, like cartels were not running illegal immigration rings, right? Every person who crossed the border didn't have to pay a drug cartel and pay a smuggler, and not just pay them, but go into debt, be in sort of a modern day form of slavery. We have people in this country who are maybe here legally or they're legally here pending their asylum hearing, or maybe they have temporary protected status, and they are indebted to a foreign criminal syndicate for thousands and thousands of dollars. That should worry every American. We should try to figure out a way to put an end to that. It's not compassionate to the people who are coming and are getting themselves into that situation. It's not good for the country, and it certainly isn't good for the border communities that have to deal with sort of this volatile situation and these sort of, like I said, rolling crises that always seem to come along every couple of years.
Can you speak to how the cartels have been able to endear themselves to some communities in Mexico and Central America? Because that does seem to me to be a very important dynamic, that they have ingratiated themselves with particular communities and people by providing services here and there. And actually, I imagine that in some of those communities, the cartels are popular with some people. Can you speak to that sort of strategic push from the cartels?
Yeah, there was really this year, over the past year, it's been really fascinating to see the way the cartels have stepped into a role as like a social services provider in some areas of Mexico and in Central America. There was last spring and early summer, started getting footage out of some places in Mexico where cartel vans and SUVs, some of them with the logo of the cartel like painted on the side of the van or the SUV, pulling up to like these city centers and these city squares where people had lined up, and they just like distributing food and face masks and sort of responding to sort of the early COVID lockdowns the way a government would, providing services to people and providing sort of like welfare to people and as you say, endearing themselves to those populations. And this isn't necessarily new in Mexico, sort of the idea of the cartel peace, that a powerful cartel kind of imposes order and peace in an area. And, as long as everybody's okay, with them kind of being, running their business. But the idea that the cartel would kind of take over in some places, things that are usually the things that the government would do, is more along the model of like a Hezbollah that provides a lot of services, for like literally for constituents and wins the loyalty of the people for that. That has happened and is happening in Mexico. In some places, the line between the cartel and the local or state government is blurred. And, we've had a lot of revelations over the past year as well of very, very high level Mexican officials. We're talking like the equivalent of the director of the FBI or the Secretary of Defense. These are former officials who were indicted and arrested on drug trafficking charges and corruption charges in the United States for working for the Sinaloa cartel. These are when you have your defense minister who is being paid by the Sinaloa cartel. It's hard to know, like, is Mexico a functioning, democracy? Is it a functioning state, or is it a narco state? Is it do we have a partner that we can work with there, or do we have a failed state that we need to start thinking strategically about? How long can we have a failed state on our southern border? So that these are things that Americans are going to have to start thinking about sooner or later.
That's a good segue into the next question that I wanted to ask, which is, how would you assess AMLO's presidency so far? How is he perhaps responding to, shaping, or diminishing perhaps the appetite for populism that we're told sort of thrusted him into office in the first place?
I think from what I understand, and from the people I've talked to in Mexico, AMLO's presidency has been a disaster. It is a kind of a cult of personality. He's really a kind of a Trump-esque figure in a way. He was portrayed by the media, the U.S. media, as sort of this left-wing kind of a Bernie Sanders type. He's more of a Trump figure, really. There is a cult of personality around him. He has a lot of sort of personal magnetism. And charisma. A lot of people really love him. He is very patriotic, very nationalistic. He represents sort of the people. He's a man of the people, and he has a reputation for sort of caring for the poor and railing against the elites. Of course, despite the fact that he himself is kind of an elite, but he has a kind of a personal austerity and personal charisma that resonates with people. So, despite the fact that Mexico's economy is doing terribly, despite the fact that Mexico's response to the coronavirus was a complete disaster, one of the worst in the world, despite the fact that homicides in Mexico are on track to be at a record high this year, to break last year's record high, despite the fact that the cartels are more powerful than ever and completely in control of certain parts of the country, AMLO is still popular. Because he says the right things, and he has this sort of persona. He talks to the media. He holds these sort of long, rambling press conferences where he sort of pontificates about different things in a very Trump-like fashion. And he's also, despite being sort of a left-wing politician, he's very much about austerity. He thinks that the government should reduce its spending, that Mexican elites have used the government to enrich themselves for too long, which is true. But that we need to impose austere measures to get government spending under control. So in some ways, like very fiscally conservative views. But he has not. And this is a long answer to your question. What he has not done is move against the cartels or speak a bad word about the cartels. He recently, I think he was in December, specifically made a stop to pay a respectful visit to El Chapo's mother, and was photographed like shaking her hand, like at the height of the coronavirus. And also during the coronavirus, he said all these crazy stuff about how he has these like lucky charms and amulets that will like protect him from the virus, and that the virus can't touch Mexico. Anyway, so he, unlike his predecessors, he is not moving against the cartels. And I don't know if there's a strategy behind that, or if it's just like he just wants to ignore it and hope it goes away. But the effect has been to embolden the cartels and to make them to increase their strength and to increase their presence. They're not afraid to kind of operate in the open anymore. And the corruption that comes with a strong cartel presence in certain parts of the country is just sort of is becoming increasingly just kind of accepted. Because AMLO has made it clear that he, unlike Calderon, who launched the Mexico's drug war in 2006, and unlike Enrique Peña Nieto, who was the AMLO's predecessor, he's not going to like start a drug war with Mexico's cartels.
So is Mexico a failed state? When you have the head of state acting that way, shaking hands with El Chapo's mother, among many, many other things, is Mexico, in your opinion, a failed state?
I think that in some ways it is. I would say it's a failing state. We can't just kind of trundle along like this. Because the problems that Mexico has eventually become problems for the United States. And so our strategy, kind of our long-term strategy of benign neglect, has got to come to an end sooner or later. Uh, uh, and if it doesn't, then the price is going to be paid first by border communities in the United States, and eventually by our cities and communities across the country. The American people would not tolerate, let's say, like having a 2,000-mile border with Somalia or Syria, and we're not there yet. But that's the direction we're headed, and all it takes is sort of like a global pandemic, or a series of hurricanes, or a cartel war, or a change in administration that unleashes a flood of migrants to make things worse, and get us closer to the point where Mexico is sort of a failed state, and functionally we don't have a partner there to deal with on things like border security, or on controlling the flow of drugs, or knowing who is coming into the border, or who's coming through the country from other parts of the world. Because keep in mind, these migrants don't just come from Central America; they come from all over the world. And so there's some security concerns as well, about who might be able to get into the country on an extremely porous border. But if we don't have a partner there, then it becomes very difficult to exert any kind of control over our border, and over our nation as a whole.
I'll zoom out for my last question to you and ask, as somebody who's done extensive reporting on the border, who's been to the border, who's reported, information from sources and all of that stuff, what would you say what is the thing that people, maybe on the left and the right, what do people not understand about the situation at the border? What are some of the key misconceptions that you identify in the sort of public conversation about immigration that are sort of off the mark from what is actually happening on the ground?
I think one of the main things that people don't understand, and I've said it before, but I'll go out on this note. The border is a massive black market industry that includes drugs, weapons, and now labor. So people cross the border by and large, from whether it's from Central America or different parts of Mexico, because they want to come to the United States to work. So they are economic migrants by definition. Most of them have families back in their home countries that they are sending money to. They are hoping to get into the United States and start working so they can send money home. That's a vast majority of people who are coming. So when the media says, oh, these are people who are seeking asylum, they're fleeing violence and poverty. They are fleeing violence and poverty because they live in violent and impoverished countries. That's why they're coming to the United States. Most of the people who come, they are economic migrants, and they are part of a industrial black market in migrant smuggling. Some of them, not most, but some of them are also part of a black market in the drug trade. The amount of money that changes hands at the border is mind-boggling. I don't think people realize, it's not just drugs or guns. It's illegal immigration. It's a big business, and that is kind of relatively new development. That was not the case 10 or 20 years ago, but that is the case now, and we need to start thinking about that. We need to be clear about what's going on if we have any hope of getting this under control.
You can read John's story. It's leading our site right now. It's called Cartels Introduce Wristband Inventory System for Illegal Immigrants. You can read that up on the Federalist.com. There's pictures and videos there, all courtesy of Jason Jones of Tripwires and Triggers. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Emily. My pleasure.
Well, we'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.